You're muted. Now I'm back on. I don't know when I did that, but anyway, shalom again, everyone. It's Wednesday and it's the 8th of Tammuz. And for those who are unaware, this is the day in which the Babylonian army actually broke through the first barriers into the city of Jerusalem. It'll be another month before they finally take down the temple, but it's right now they have just breached the walls and are now fighting inside the city of Jerusalem itself on this day. Now, as we're going through this, we have two parshas this week that we could be studying. Last year, I spent a lot of time talking about Hukot, and I talked about the ashes of the red heifer as much as I knew. So I decided this year I'm going to talk about Bela. And probably this is one of those chapters where there is so much to teach and so little time, so many hidden stories that it really demands more than a week of actual intense study. And that's probably why they give them a week and they spend 7 days breaking down the parsha into pieces, but I don't have that time. So I'm just going to try to share as much as I possibly can of that which I've just learned and that which I've known for quite a while. Now, the chapter is called Balak, and most of the rabbis question why we should name a parsha section after a wicked king. But the other option that they had was actually to call it Parsha Balaam, because Balaam is the other major character in this section. And Balaam was a prophet, but it was not the kind that the Jews would prefer to avoid talking about. But anyway, Balaam is going to be the main character. He's the only prophet other than Moses to talk between Exodus and now here Deuteronomy. He's the only one, and he's a Gentile. And according to the Jewish understanding, Balaam was equal in prophetic abilities to Moses. Now, Moses saw him face to face. Balaam heard him. Balaam had an ear for the words of God. And so there's going to be two different ways of understanding this, and we'll get into that as we go along. In the book of, in the Rabbah, which is a Midrashic writing, Rabbah Numbers 14:2, it says, in Israel he has not arisen, but among the nations he did arise. And who is he? He is Balaam. So it's talking about the man Balaam who has risen. Now, we've heard of Balaam since the book of Exodus. If you remember, Balaam was one of the three prophets. And again, among them was Jethro, and the other one was Job. And finally, there is Balaam. They were the advisors to the Pharaoh. It was Balaam who gave the advice of drowning the babies. Jethro and Job both fled. They both left. Neither one was willing to participate in that. But as we go through our story, then what we're going to find is that Balaam manages to go to many places throughout his journeys. He'll end up in Carthage for a while. And from Carthage, he goes to Rome. From Rome, he goes to Greece. And from Greece, he ends up back in Assyria. And that's where we find him at this particular point in time in our stories. But as he moves from place to place, a great number of characters become very visible. While he was in Carthage, a character called Hannibal became noticeable. Now, Carthage was a city that was built by the Jews and the Phoenicians through King Tyre, or Hiram, who was the king of Tyre at that time. They are the ones who established the city of Carthage. Now, Hannibal was there, and I don't think I've ever told anybody before, but I think I've left it in my notes that Hannibal's last name was Barca in Phoenician, but his real last name in Hebrew was Barak. You see, he was a Jew. Hannibal was a Jew. because that was a Jewish city. And it was founded for the purposes of trading. And it became, after Israel and after Phoenicia became conquered by the Romans, it was still flourishing and still functioning. But as our story goes on, I want to get to the understanding that technically there were 3 times that Balaam chose to, well, he didn't choose, he wanted to curse Israel. Now remember, Balak, who was the king of Moab, actually found out he was going to be king from Balaam. Balaam was in his city called Pesor, and while he was at Pesor, he announced to Balaam, or to Balak, you will become king. So it was always in his mind that he would be a king, and then when he became a king, he now has established himself as the king over the Midianites and the Moabites. Now it was a kind of a common relationship. In other words, they were like city-states, only they're major countries at that point in time. But in the process of establishing themselves, they understood, first off, that the Jewish people had already passed through. I need to go back and give you some more data. What we're talking about, these lessons or this section, probably occurred about 50 days before, the last 50 days of Moses's life, as I understand it. They had already gone north. They had taken on the king of Sion and defeated him. They had taken on the king of Og and defeated him. Those were now Jewish territories. They didn't cross over to Israel, but came back down to the south towards the end of the Dead Sea. And I'm not sure how far down they went. We know that they crossed at Jericho, but I'm not sure where the camp was actually set. One of the mountains appears to be Pisgah, another one is Nebo. So we're all in about that same area. And so at this point in time, Israel is now camped, and the Moabites are becoming fearful. Well, actually, Balak is becoming fearful because his businesses were in the line of sight as he saw it, because he had established for himself the religion of Peor. Peor was a religion that was totally blasphemous. But among his many things that he did was establish his own, quote, church. And a part of that church was the establishment of prostitutes, women who would work for him. Those women would become the women that we would find in the next section with Pincus, as they established a relationship. But at this point in time, it was not about that relationship. It was about my business. How do I keep it where it is? That's the assumption that's made in some of the Midrashic writings. Now, as we're going through this, then what we're going to be looking at is 3 times Balak has asked Balaam to come down, and 3 times he's refused. Not because he didn't want to come down, but because God told him he didn't want to come down. We're going to get the time when he will allow him to. We'll go through the donkey experience, which I'm not going to talk about. And we're going to talk about, or try to focus on, the 3 meetings that he's going to have. So I want you to turn first off to the book of Numbers, and I want you to go to chapter number 22. And in here, we're going to talk about the first and the second times that he's going to find himself. I guess it's chapter 23. I'm sorry, chapter 23. And we're going to begin in about verse 7. Okay. He begins by saying, from Aram, which is the kingdom which we would call Assyria in that northern area, Balak, king of Moab, led me from the mountains of the east. So what we're talking about here is Balaam has now been encouraged to leave. Now it says he leaves from the mountains of the east, which doesn't mean anything to us normally. But I want to tell you about the Zohar and how it draws in this understanding of the mountains of the east. The east winds are winds that are treacherous, they're evil. The same thing about these mountains. In fact, according to the Zohar, they're also called the mountains of darkness. Now, the reason they received that name by understanding of the Midrash is the fact that two of the angels who descended in the book of Genesis in the 6th chapter and who had been influencing the people and actually began to marry the people was named Azal or Oz and Azel. Those two characters were chained inside the mountain in near Iran. And so that is where Balaam first came under the influence of the negative, became part of the world, if you will. And much of his prophetic abilities came from things that he learned there. Not only was he one of the students of these two angels, but so was a character called Laban. Laban, the father-in-law of Jacob. So these men had been learning from him, and they had picked up their craft. Now, Balaam knew that he should not go, but finally God acquiesces and said, "You may go." But he understood that he couldn't speak unless God allowed him to speak. So we leave here in verse 7, it says, "Come curse Jacob for me, come bring anger upon Israel. How can I curse? God has not cursed. How can I anger? Hashem has not angry." Understand that's a key sentence, and we're going to see it again. What we need to understand is the fact that Balaam understood there was a second, and I emphasize a second, and actually it was only a part of a second that God ever displayed anger during the course of a day, that anger towards Israel. It lasted approximately, according to the sages, it lasted 1/23 of a second. Well, actually, that's the English time. I can't remember what it's in Hebrew, but 1/23 of a second. I want you to imagine the old days, the days of the first movies on black and white film. When they were creating those movies, if you remember, each movie had a little pixel in it, and there was a black space that was on the edge. Now, in order for that movie to be shown, you had to get it to a speed of 24 cells in the course of a matter of seconds. What Balaam was able to do was he could see the black cell in between each of the slides, if you will. That is how he understood the anger of God, because it became black, dark in that area. And again, he worked with darkness so that this became part and parcel. Now, so when it says, "How can I curse? God has not cursed." God has that fraction of a second where he can or has the ability or the willingness to curse Israel for some of the stupid things that they've done. But it only lasts 1/23 of a second. So in other words, when he performs this curse, he is actually drawing off of that black space in between those individual pictures. That's what's going on. I hope I've made it clear enough that you can at least begin to see in your head that's what's going on. Now, as he's doing this, how can I anger? Yeah, how can I anger? Hashem is not angry. On the days in which Balaam is seeking to bring this curse upon Israel using God, God does not demonstrate any anger. And so as he's speaking this sentence, what he's speaking is what's going on in God's mind. He literally hears from God. That is how he's understanding what to do and how to do it. Verse 9 goes on to say, "For from its origins I see a rock like, and from hills do I see it. Behold, it is a nation that will dwell in solitude and not be reckoned among the nations." This is the same thing that's going to be spoken of in the book of Isaiah in the chapter 51. And it also becomes a part of the story in Deuteronomy later on when he talks about the fact that this is a nation that is not like any of the other nations. It's separate. It is God's nation. So he looks at it in an entirely different way. "Who has counted the dust of Jacob or numbered the quarter of Israel. May my soul die the death of an upright, and may my end be like his. So in other words, this is what Balaam wishes to be. Again, he is a tremendous prophet. He's one of 7 Gentile prophets. I don't know if you knew that there were 7 of them. Balaam is the first. Well, actually, Balaam's the second. The first one was his father, Beor. Beor was a great prophet also to Gentiles. Also, we should list Job. Job would be the third one. The fourth one would be Jethro. And finally, Job's 3 friends. Those are the 7 prophets or the Gentiles. Those were the ones that we would normally think of. Balak becomes angry because he can't curse him. That's the first attempt. The second attempt is written down in verse number 18. He declaimed his parable and said, "Stand erect, O Balak, and hear. Give ear to me, O son of Zippor." Now, Zippor is the word for bird. Balak was a sorcerer. Among his many talents was the creation of what would be called a mechanical bird that would sit on his shoulder. I don't know if you remember the Robert Louis Stevenson stories, Treasure Island, where the captain had a parrot that sat on his shoulders. Well, the same thing happened with Balak. The only difference is that there was his tongue, the tongue of this bird, was mechanical. And so this bird fed him information. It was not the only bird that he worked with, but that was one of the birds. And so as we go through the verse, it begins by saying, God is not a man that he should be deceitful, nor the son of a man that he should relent. Would he say and do not do, or speak and not confirm? Behold, to bless I have received. He has blessed, and I shall not contradict it. So in other words, second time, his little informant and his ear have now told him he cannot curse them, but he can, in essence, bless them. Those 2 drive Balak absolutely crazy. Balak has an argument with Balaam, but then we reach the third of these stories, the third of the blessings. And I want you to understand that this blessing is far different than any of the others. What Balaam is about to tell us is very, very prophetic. It is very much masked in the language. And so it's going to take us a while to unwrap it. And I have to tell you that I probably don't have enough time to do it justice, but I want to give you as much information as I possibly can. And if you need resources, just write me and I will send you my copy of my notes where I have some of the information. If you have more questions than that, just write me and I'll let you know. I want you to go in the book in chapter 24 at this point in time. And I want you to look at verse number 12. Chapter 24, verse number 12. Balaam said to Balak, "Did I not speak to your emissaries whom you sent to me, saying, if Balak were to give me his household in silver and gold, I cannot transgress the words of Hashem to do good or to do bad on my own. Whatever Hashem speaks, that shall I speak." So in other words, what we're going to hear are not Balaam's words. These are God's words. Okay? Understand, these are God's words. Notice what it begins. "And now behold, I go to my people. Come, I shall advise you what this people will do to your people when, at the end of days." He declaimed his parable and he said, so these words are God's words concerning the last days. So he's not talking about a year in the future. He's not talking about 100 years. He's not talking about 1,000 years. He's talking to the very end of time. That's where this parable comes in. This would be a great lead in for the study of Daniel, but it's a little short. In fact, if I was really smart, I would have used the book of Daniel and the Parsha Korach, because Daniel is in the book of Korach, or in the Parsha of Korach. Notice what he says. "The word of Balaam, son of Beor, the words of the man with the open eye." Now, some say that Balaam was a man who was blind in one eye and was lame. Others recognize the fact that he only has one eye, indicating that the other eye was evil. So he had the evil eye. Now, according to his disciples, or what they identify as his disciples themselves had a problem of the evil eye also. They were able to project using that evil eye, bringing curses upon things that they had learned from the two angels in the mountains. So anyway, he begins and says, the words of one who hears the sayings of God. Listen, he can hear God's voice. That's key. So as a prophet, he doesn't see him face to face, but he hears him clearly. That's the most important thing that we need to understand. That's why he is on the same level prophetically as Moses. He was his equal and knows the knowledge of the Supreme One. So he understands God. God has spoken with him. He understands who God is. He understands about God. And he understands his limits, what he is capable of and what he cannot do. Who sees the vision of Shaddai. Now again, here's a name that hasn't been used in quite a long time. This is the idea of the speaker of the creations. So he knows him as the creator, the one who was enough that Abraham met, while fallen and with uncovered eyes. This goes back to the Zohar, and I'll come back to it. Now, verse 17, I'm using my art scroll. And so I have done some editing. I have taken words out. I will begin by reading, and I took shall out. I see him. That's what it actually says in the literal. I see him. When? Not now. I look at him, but he is not near. A star has issued from Jacob, and a scepter bearer has risen from Israel. A star has issued from Jacob, one, and a scepter bearer has risen from Israel, and he shall pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine the children of Seth. This is huge. This is really huge. So we're talking about two characters, not one. This is our first hint of Mashiach ben Joseph and Mashiach ben David. This is where we're beginning to come from. One is with the idea of Jacob, the other was with the idea of Israel. And we know that Jacob was used both names. But when they use the name Jacob, we speak of a human. When we use the name Israel, we're thinking of the more ethereal kind of names. But this is where we're going to begin with this story. So as we begin, I want you to understand, now I'm going to my people. Come, I will advise you. Now he's going to his people. In other words, he has no ability to curse Israel. And he understands that he's going to go home at this point. He's going to be of no use. But before he goes, he wants him to know what's going to happen, at least in the end. So he's talking about the Akrit Hayomin, or the end of days. And he uses a parable to do it with, okay? Now the word of Balaam, son of Beor, the word of a man with one open eye. The book of Sanhedrin 105 says that he was blind in one eye, he was lame, and that his disciples and he both had an evil eye. They were haughty and they were avaricious in spirit. This is how they were described in 105. Rashi doesn't even want to go that far. He just simply says as little as possible, giving him as little credit as possible. Now, the word of one who hears God saying and perceives the thoughts of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, fallen yet with open eyes. I see it, but not now. Okay, so here we go. I go from here. I want to take you to another rabbi. Rabbi's name was Orheim. Orheim. He would be, Or is light, Heim is life. So he is the, in his own mind or in his own teachings, he becomes the light of life for his people. Now in his commentary, I want to read some of it to you. I see him, but not now. I behold him, he is not near. There shall set forth a star out of David, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. That's Numbers 24:17. It's referring to two different aspects of redemption. Two aspects of redemption captured later by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 60, verse 22. It's the famous phrase, in its time, I will hasten it. You remember that one? The sages say in Sanhedrin 98a, explain it that the first word, in its time, refers to the Mashiach coming like a pauper on a donkey. And the second word, I will hasten it, refers to the Mashiach coming as if he were riding on the clouds of heaven. There is even another hint within that. The clouds of heaven. When Balaam is seeing this, imagine, if you will, he's looking down into a valley, he sees the village, but what's above the village? The cloud of glory is over the village. So when he talks about the fact that in the end, this cloud of glory will reappear, if it is due to the fact that they're ready for it and it's early, they will see it that way. Otherwise, it's like a donkey. And you know how well a donkey behaves to every command that you give it. So he's really trying to hint at something that's going on here. He goes back to the fact and he says, I see him, but now, perhaps not now, but in the near future. It is the possibility of redemption occurring very soon. That's what he's hoping for. That's what corresponds to I would hasten it. But I behold him, but he's not near. The Orheim says that I can see the redemption, but it's still very distant, which is idea of the fact that it will come in its own time. Now, the second part of the verse also continues with the parallel. A star has stepped forth from Jacob. The Mashiach arrives upon heavenly clouds, and I will hasten it. That is what he's thinking. And a scepter shall rise out of Israel. The branch grows slowly from bottom up, and this alludes to the Mashiach arriving on the donkey. But the idea is the fact that what he's saying is he can arrive two ways. One is he arrives, but nobody notices him. And so he does not appear to anybody until later on. Interestingly, the verse refers to the Mashiach coming with haste on a heavenly clouds, calls the Jewish people Jacob. He should have called him Israel, but he doesn't. He uses the word Jacob as he's going through this, as opposed to using the word Israel, which is his imminent name. The Or HaHaim explains that hasty redemption depends on the Benjamin of Israel. Who are the Benjamin? There are three levels. There's the level of the Zadikim, the level of Benonim, the level of the Rashas. So he is talking about the middle level. They determine when the Messiah will come. They are the ones that he's thinking of. They're the ones that he's speaking to, is this middle group. Because the Orheim was constantly preaching redemption, resurrection, the whole final ends of time. He goes on to say, the Orheim further explains that if the Benonim, the immediates, rely on the pious Zakim to bring the redemption, it will be a slow donkey ride. Slow donkey ride. Now the text goes on to say in our story, Edom shall be possessed and Seir shall become the possession of his enemies, and Israel shall triumph. The ruler shall come out of Jacob, and destroy the remnant of the city. He goes on to say, when he saw Amalek, he took up his parable and he said, Amalek was the first of the nations, and his fate shall be an everlasting destruction. Now, when he saw what I called, when he saw the Kani, if we're back in the text, verse number 21, he saw the Kenites. That's not the correct interpretation. I went to 3 different sources, and this is what I understand. And if you'd go to the right-hand side, and if you have an art scroll, it's 1, 2, 3, the 4th line up from the bottom, and the 3rd word over. The word is Keni, Hakeni, the Cain. So we're now talking about Cain. He saw the Cain and declaimed his parable and said, strong is your dwelling, and nest in a rock is your, or set in the rock is your nest. Clarity, I got to get you some clarity. So this is about the future. Is what we're talking about, is about the future. Clarity will come to this world just like clarity left. Do you remember how clarity left? Adam and Hava both partook of the fruit. Not only did Hava give the fruit to Adam, she gave it to all the animals. All the animals will die. We see that all the time. But there was one animal that was said to survive out of this because he escaped from the whole thing. Now, it depends on what culture you're in as to what you call this, but it's a bird. Remember Zippor? Now we're going to talk about another bird. We're going to talk about the bird called the phoenix. The phoenix is actually a Jewish term. It comes by way of Phoenicia. It's a word that Solomon and Hiram have identified. But this bird lives in a tree. It nests. The word for nest is ken. So what we're talking about is this Cain is living in a ken. He's living in a nest. Where is the nest that he's living in? Well, it's set in a rock, and your nest is on high. So what if you were in Lebanon along the coastlines? You find that there are trees along the coastline of now modern day Lebanon, what's left of it. And the trees are either pine or cedar. Now, cedar being a strong, rich tree is what he's really talking about. So for Cain should have been laid waste to where can Assyria take you captive? This is a very difficult passage. Phoenix, if we go to the stories, I'm going to skip some of this and I'm just going to go straight to the stories. We know Phoenicia is better named Lebanon. We also know that Hiram and Solomon worked together. They established not only a navy, and they established cities across the globe, which meaning was along the Mediterranean. But they also, in the combination of those two things, Solomon gave 20 cities along the Sea of Galilee to Hiram. They became his cities. So the two nations were intermixed at this particular point in time because Hiram, remember, gave the trees. What tree did he send to Israel to become part of the temple? The cedar tree. So we're going back and we're having references back and forth between the trees. Now, again, in the Midrashic writings, Hava gave all the animals but one, and that was a bird that flew away. Now, in the oldest midrashic writings, the bird was called a chol, a kaf lamed, or a het lamed. That was the name of this bird. It was translated later to be phoenix. And if you want, there's a whole writing about this in Chabad.org, because there was the Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, wrote his story to a Jewish woman whose husband had just passed away, who spent her time after his death creating phoenixes, making statuary. And the people told her to quit doing that because you're creating a foul bird. Well, she went to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, no. And he gave her a whole story of how the phoenix was actually a Jewish bird. And she accepted that, and she continued to create more statues. But anyway, this idea is that, well, can you turn in your Bibles to the book of Job, chapter 8 or chapter 29? And I want you to look at the 18th verse, chapter 29. Yeah, that's not it. What did I do? Oh, I'm looking at the wrong chapter. That's why. Yeah. Verse number 18. I said to myself, I will expire with my nest intact. I will live as long as the phoenix. Do you see it? Now, why did Job put this there? What is it that I should be understanding out of this? Notice how it begins. My roots will be opened. Well, that's the wrong verse. I said to myself, I will expire with my nest. Do you remember the story of the phoenix? The phoenix itself, it catches fire while it's sitting in its nest. The nest is destroyed and the bird is destroyed. But when it's all said and done, in the midst of the ashes is an egg. The egg hatches and a phoenix rises out of the egg. Imagine in your own mind, had Adam and Eve not sinned, how long would they have lived? There's no end. We know that he does not last a day, which is 1,000 years, and he comes close. He dies at 930, but he gave 70 years to David. Imagine a world that we live in where every 1,000 years you are recreated, just like a phoenix. You rise from the ash. You went mute. I don't know how I do it. So let me go back and ask again. I don't know how much I muted myself. Every 1,000 years, had Adam lived past 1,000, would he have been like the phoenix? Would he have become ashes? From the ashes rose again. What's the purpose of fire? Purification. The phoenix rises from the ashes, from the purification. What happens? It's new again and continues on. In our story then, go back to our chapter 24. In our story then, what we're looking at is an animal called a phoenix, which is also a metaphor as we go through this. Now, the Talmud begins to talk about this, and I want to add some information at this point in time because it's becoming important. Where we talk about Seth. Now I lost it in my notes. To the discerner. This is so complicated. I don't want to mess it up. Let me go back to reading the text again, see where I missed it. So let's go back to verse number 21 and we'll change Kenite to Cain. He saw that Cain and declaimed his parable and said, strong is your dwelling and the set in the rock in your nest. For if the Cain should be laid waste, till where can Assyria take you captive? When was Cain ever laid waste? Cain died, but when was he ever laid waste? The answer is he never was. Why is that important? Well, let me shortcut and go to the end of the story. We have a situation of needing to rectify the sin of Cain. Do you remember what Cain's sin was? The taking down of his brother. In order for the world to become rectified, that first sin has to be taken care of. Cain, who kills his brother, must be killed. Now, the question then becomes, how do you kill somebody who is dead? Well, the answer is he's not dead completely, because we have what we call the regeneration. If you study Kabbalah, you understand that there's what they call reincarnation. The book of Job 26, I think 19, talks about the fact that you can reincarnate at least 3 times. But that's beside the point. Cain must die. In order for Cain to die, what has to happen is the fact that, well, there has to come a point in time in which Cain will reappear. We had a situation of, 20 years ago when Saddam Hussein believed that he was, do you remember, the king? He was Nebuchadnezzar, and he was rebuilding Babylon because he had the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar. But he has now since died. But again, that was the idea of reincarnation as the Semitic world actually understands it. In our story then, what's happening is the fact that, well, in Sukkah 52a, let me read it to you. Sukkah 52a. Apropos the eulogy at the end of days, the Gemara asks, for what is the nature of this eulogy? What's he talking about here? The Gemara said Rabbi Dosa and the rabbis disagree concerning this matter. One said that the eulogy was for the Messiah ben Joseph, who was killed in the war of Gog and the land of Magog prior to the ultimate redemption of the coming of the Messiah, David, and was said that this eulogy is for the death also of the evil inclination. So this war that's called the War of Gog and Magog is going to be the war that eventually leads to complete redemption for the world, and the evil inclination will be killed. Now, by evil inclination, remember, when Adam and Eve were first created, they had the evil inclination, but the evil inclination was not active. It only became active after the taking of the fruit. Before that, they could clearly see what is right and what is wrong. In the world to come, you and I will know exactly what is right, and we will know exactly what is wrong, and basically we will have killed our evil inclination. There won't be any gray areas anymore. We will know right from wrong, even to the slightest. Well, in the section, it goes on to say, once the Messiah ben David saw that ben Joseph, who was killed, he says to the Holy One, blessed be he, the master of the universe. I ask of you only life, that I will not suffer from the same fate. The Holy One, blessed be he, says to him, life. Even before you stated this request, your father, David, already prophesied that you, with regard to this matter precisely as it is stated. He has asked life of you. You gave it to him, even length of days, and how long? Forever and ever. Turn in your book to Psalms, Psalms 21, verse 5. Now again, David the Messiah is now asking for life to come back into David, or into Messiah Joseph. And so in his prayer, he asks, and God says, you don't have to ask because it was already asked. Your father David, back in chapter 21 and verse number 5, says, life is requested of you. You as God. You gave it to him. How much? Length of days. For how long? Ever and ever. So Messiah ben Joseph will die, and he will be dead for a period of time. But Messiah ben Joseph is the reincarnation of Cain. He's the human side. David is the spiritual side. After the death of Cain, which is going to be measure for measure. Remember, Cain killed his brother. Measure for measure. God will take out him. Now, Joseph himself has demonstrated to be good. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, and you go back to Adam and Eve in the garden, you know, after they left the garden, it was Cain who killed Abel. But he killed him, if we look at just the text there, he kills him because the fact his offering wasn't as good. But who does God talk to? Not to Abel. He talks to Cain. If you would have. In other words, Cain's spirit was actually better than Abel's at that point. But he did something wrong. But later he becomes the very first person to truly ever repent. And God accepted repentance, but there's still the problem of measure for measure. Didn't happen in what we call his lifetime, but it will happen at the end, when Mashiach ben Yosef will be killed because of the fact that he had taken the first life. Now, David the Messiah, he is going to come along and pray for him. And what will happen? He will be raised from the dead, resurrections, the beginning of the resurrection period. And what will it be the end result? Forever and ever. That will be the result of what's going on. I've talked long enough and I need to let you talk to me. But I want to close with this. This is a daily thought from Chabad. The Holy Zohar tells of a time when we will all study its secret wisdom. That's the Torah's. And truly digest its meaning so that it will nurture us and give us life. And that will allow the final liberation to come with a gentle compassion rather than with harsh judgments. Now the wisdom is no longer secret. The Bel Shem Tov, the Great Nagid, the Alter Rebbe, and others have made it accessible and meaningful to all. Those who learn it and spread it, they are bringing divine compassion and spiritual freedom to the world. I hope I didn't leave you confused too much, but I hope to leave you some time so you can talk to me. This is a very difficult parsha. Well, it's actually a very difficult chapter. And I want you to, as much as you can, meditate on this and go back and look at it. And if you've gotten my notes, then read my notes again and look at them closely. Because there's so much in these three prophecies. Two of them have very little newness in them, but that third one is filled with new ideas that you probably have not studied, because we've never looked at it or I should say, I have never looked at it quite this way. But the more I look at the Zohar, the more I go back to the Rebbe's and go back to the Chabad and to the Kabbalistic side of it, I find myself seeing a lot more deeply into the text. And so it's very difficult to pull it out of my head in 8 pages. And in this case, 50 minutes. So I don't know if you have any questions now, but I appreciate it. Mary, you've got one?
Yeah, just a comment, I guess. You said Balaam not only possessed lofty spiritual powers, but he was truly a prophet of God, a human being with a live connection with the Holy One, blessed be he. And then you said, in spite of his prophetic ability, the sages list Balaam as the pathalon of the evilest character in their history. I just found that very thought-provoking.
Well, thank you. Balaam is always given the bad side, which he deserves. But he also had something that nobody else had. He had the ability to hear God. I mean, not that we don't have the ability to hear God, but he could hear him daily. He knew exactly when God was angry with Israel. There's a story that says that Balaam, when Mount Sinai happened on the first day and God is now speaking his first 2 commandments, the world hears the noise. The world is in crisis. They don't know what's happening. They often think that there's another deluge coming, and they were all asking one another. And over a period of time, Balaam's message reaches all of them. By that I mean, he simply explains to them that the God of Israel has given his people the laws that they will need to live by, that we should all live by. And he puts himself in that same category. Balaam knew the law as well as Moses did. He heard it, unlike most people. He heard the law. And yet, at the same point in time, money and power overpowered him. And he lost his position. Like many others, I should say. So anyway, yeah, thank you for noticing that. That's what I was trying to get across.
It just
Less than 100
reminded
words.
me. It just reminded me that we all have to really work at staying humble.
The more you know, the more you understand that that's exactly what God wants, is humility from all of us.
And it can easily escape us if we let it.
Yeah. Easily escape us. That is a hard story to sell. But that's the story that's there. Anybody else got a thought or a confused point that I can clarify tonight before you leave me? Mike?
Huge. Yeah, Balaam is such an interesting character. We know he counseled Pharaoh to kill the Jews, and he had this hatred of the Jews. Yet, in a sense, as they say, he was equal to Moses in that he knew, but Moses didn't know when God would speak to him, so Moses always had to be ready. Balaam knew when God would speak to him. And it's just this whole confluence of human beings. It's just how'd you be here and here and this and that? It's just amazing and fascinating to think about. And hopefully none of us will ever be as confused as Balaam. But I don't know, if for a man who could hear God and have such hate and, like you said, greed and longing for greatness, it's odd confluence of different personalities in this one particular person. My one question I had, it seemed like in Exodus, he's called, not Exodus, Joshua calls him a sorcerer.
Mhm.
And it seems like he was a prophet for maybe not a very long time. I'm thinking after these prophecies that you just said, I think prophecy went away from him and he just died as a normal human being, and that was it, and called a sorcerer. And would you?
Well, yeah, if you want to, my understanding is that Balaam goes home after having left the word with them. If you want to get God to curse them, use the women. Now, the women that are used, if you're unaware, he is developing his own little private hotel brothel. And those are the women, the Moabite and Midianite women. Those are the women he's using to tempt the Israelites, and gets all the way to Cosby and all of that other that goes with it. Well, after he finds out that God has cursed him and there's a plague going through the camp, Balaam turns around and comes back. He comes back expecting to receive his reward because he didn't curse him, but he got God to curse him. So therefore he was due a reward. Well, in going back, he ends up arriving just in time to watch Pincus and the Israelite army go in to destroy the Moabites and the Midianites at that particular point in time. And oh, by the way, Balak is related to the Messiah. You see, Balak's son was actually the father of Ruth. So you go from Balak to Eglon, from Eglon to Ruth. Ruth is now married into the family. Ruth has now become a part of the community. And so technically, you are trying to kill the people in which you are a part of the glory of that kingdom. Is that justice or what? Hard to live with. Amazing thoughts. Go ahead, Ross, your turn.
Well, again, genealogy or the lineage thing plays a card here. The Moabites, no Moabite shall ever become a member of Israel, right? So they're converts from there. But again, Moabite, how shall I say that? Interfamily sexual relations, okay? And that's what they were told not to do at Sinai. You don't do this with your aunt, your uncle, your dad's stepwife, and so, right? I mean, all of these prohibitions came down at Sinai. And he's like, aha, they were warned against this. And the very people that had already done that and were known to have done it, he says, well, okay, well, we're not related, but we'll go in and tempt them with, like you said, sex, right? Ruth actually is an 11th generation Moabitess. And that's how she comes to marry in later on.
Yeah.
It's a prohibition against the men, but not the women, which I never could understand because it was the women who caused all the problem.
Well, and it was the women that tried to save the world. Remember?
Yeah.
What was the child's name that came out of the relationship between Lot and his daughter? Moab.
Moab and Ammon.
Yes. Which I think also would be found in part of that description of don't intermarry or don't deal with sexual relations within the confines of this group. But anyway.
Right.
Anybody else? I'm glad I've overwhelmed you with stuff that you have to think about for quite a while before you jump on me. Anyway, I just want to remind you, I'm planning on teaching out all the series on the Parshas. And the back in fall, when the Parshas restart, that's when I will go through Daniel. I told everybody I would start Daniel and share that with people. They found it to be interesting, and I do too, but you know, prophecy is one thing, but it's not the only thing, although it became a big thing here in this section of the book. So anyway, for the good of the order, anybody else? Thank you. Have a good night. Shalom,
you.
Lila Tov.
Shalom,
Shalom.
Lila Tov.
Lila.